Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Going to talk about climate change. And before we do, just do me a quick favor. If you like this show, tell your friends about it. And of course, hit subscribe. But climate change. Man, our Canadian government, we've spent billions upon billions of dollars, your tax dollars, to battle CO2 emissions. The question is it working? Is it necessary? What is it about CO2 that's so dangerous to us as Canadian citizens and as world citizens, right? Our guest today has a few things to say on this. Gregory Wrightstone, he's a geologist, also the executive director of the CO2 Coalition, and the best-selling author of a book called A Very Convenient Warming. How modest warming and more CO2 are benefiting humanity. That book is available at convenientwarming.com, and you'll find a lot of helpful information at co2coalition.org. So thanks for making time for us today.
Good to be on with you. So I bring you great tidings of glad tidings of great joy about the flourishing of our ecosystems and benefits to humanity. I call it the greatest untold story of the 21st century, that of a thriving planet, and we should celebrate that.
Yeah, I mean, the title of your book flies in the face of the current narrative, certainly. You're saying modest warming, okay? Many fellow scientists saying the opposite. They're saying, no, there's a catastrophic global warming taking place right now, and we're in danger. So are you getting a lot of pushback on that?
Yeah, let's look. Well, you can't push back against the facts, and I have the facts on my side. And there's no dispute that since 1850, temperatures increased 1.3 degrees Celsius. That's not too alarming to me, but we're being told that we dare not let it get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so we've already warmed 1.3. So what they're telling us, we dare not let it get another 0.2 of a degree Celsius warmer.
Why? What is the
they just
problem
grabbed
with that?
Well, when they chose that number, it was 10 or 15 years ago, and it was long before we were going to get there, and we've almost reached that. And now they're wishing that they had set it at 2 degrees, I'm sure. But so what they're really warning us about is a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. Well, it warms more than that between 11 a.m. and noon every single day. And if you're worried about 0.2 of a degree of warming, move 17 miles further north, and your average temperature will increase by 0.2 of a degree. It's ludicrous what they're talking about. And it has warmed 1.3 degrees. And in Canada, most Canadians, I think, would welcome that. And in particular, we know that for a fact. Dr. Tim Ball, you're probably familiar with the late Tim Ball. He had one of his studies that I quote a lot. He looked at tree line in Canada, and I forget what year it was done. It's maybe 15 years ago, but he looked at tree line in Canada had moved 100 kilometers north over the last 100 years. So as that warming has been slowly occurring, of course, tree lines move north in the northern hemisphere, glaciers recede. But the thing to understand here is they're telling us it's warming because of man's contribution of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's what's driving it. But the warming trend we're in started more than 300 years ago. The big amounts of CO2 we started adding to the atmosphere started in the mid-20th century in that late post-World War II economic boom. And so the warming started 250 or so, 225 years before we started adding CO2. And the glaciers started retreating in the early 1800s, along with sea level rise began about that time, coming out of the horrible, very, very cold of what was called the Little Ice Age. And so glaciers started retreating, 1800s, 100 plus years before we started adding CO2. So we can dispel this notion of CO2 driving temperature by looking at it through various time periods, through hundreds of years, thousands and millions of years, to find out that, in fact, you can't correlate increase
So,
in
so what
temperature
I've
and danger.
seen, like in your book here as well, you have some graphs that point out it seems that when temperatures were very cold, the CO2 levels actually were much higher than they are now, and it seems to vary when you go back over, millions of years.
Yeah, you can see times in Earth's history. Earth alternates between what's called ice house conditions, which are very, very cold, and what are called hot house conditions, which are very, very warm. And we're happen to be in ice house condition right now, believe it or not. We're in some of the
Hmm.
coldest periods of Earth's history. It's certainly possibly 8 to 10 to 15 degrees below what the hottest temperatures were, which was most of Earth's history. And we can find times of very cold with high CO2 and low CO2 levels. We can find times of very high temperatures with high and low CO2, depending. There just doesn't seem to be a very good correlation through history.
So it would
And
be
as a
safe to say then that we can't, just by what you just explained here, we can't just simply assume that CO2 levels rising are going to spike the temperature.
well, Well, bear in mind, it gets a little. It is. There's a nuance to this in
Okay.
that carbon dioxide is increasing, and it's because of our burning of fossil fuels.
Hmm.
We've documented that in a recent report. We use 7 different lines of evidence. Some of it's fascinating. I'm a climate geek, so I think it's fascinating. But we use 7 lines of evidence to prove that the 50% increase in CO2 in the atmosphere is from us burning CO2. And CO2 increases, it's a greenhouse gas. It has a warming effect. So more CO2 means more greenhouse warming from CO2. It's just not very much. And that modest, small amount of warming is overwhelmed by natural forces, and probably mostly changes in solar activity and the amount of solar activity hitting the Earth. And again, one of the things that's interesting is we know pretty accurately our emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's pretty well documented. We also know very accurately how much of that, what the atmospheric CO2 is, how much of that's showing up in the atmosphere. And it turns out that only half of our emissions show up in the atmosphere. So you might ask, really? Where's the rest of it going?
Yeah.
And it's going into the biosphere, probably some into the oceans. And that's fuel. It's, in other words, the biosphere, the Earth's plants, vegetation are just sucking up this CO2.
Hmm.
They love CO2. They like it warm and they like CO2. And so we see just a global increase, explosion of vegetative growth from the near polar regions to the equator. And so what's that doing? It's sucking up huge amounts of CO2 that we're emitting. And it's again, you would think one of the other things that fell out of this study that I found fascinating, I didn't know, you would think with increase in vegetation, that would fuel more oxygen in the atmosphere, right? Because of
Right.
photosynthesis. Think back to when you're in middle school, you probably
Yep.
put a bean in a soil and you sprout it and you learned about that photosynthesis requires sunlight,
Hmm.
water, and CO2, and the more CO2, the better. And it gives off oxygen. So you would think with an explosion of vegetation, that would increase oxygen. What we find is actually oxygen levels in the atmosphere have actually been in decline. They're declining, not
Hmm.
significantly. It's not
Okay.
scary,
Okay.
but they are definitely in decline. And you go, why is that? That doesn't
Hmm.
make sense. Think about it though. We're burning. Think about all that CO2 that's going into the atmosphere. We're burning lots of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. And when you're burning those fossil fuels, it's consuming oxygen.
Hmm.
The simplest fossil fuel to talk about is methane because it's a very simple molecule, CH4. When you burn methane, CH4, it combines with one methane molecule, 2 oxygen molecules, and it creates, of course, heat is what we want when you burn it. And then it also emits 2 water molecules, H2O, and one carbon dioxide molecule. And so it's consuming, actually, the burning of fossil is consuming more oxygen than what the increase in plant growth is able to produce into the atmosphere.
Hmm.
Again, I'm a climate geek. You
Okay.
never heard that, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I haven't. Now, is that going to be problematic long term, or you're
No,
saying the amounts are
no,
relatively
it,
inconsequential?
no, because I don't have it's, I think 20% oxygen in the atmosphere. And it's the slight decline. It
Okay.
would, I mean,
Okay.
could it be,
So,
many, many, many millions of
yeah.
years? No, it's a slight decline, but it is a decline.
That's very interesting. Now, CO2, again, basically you're saying it's plant food. It's something
Yeah.
very necessary for the Earth system to function properly. So, more of it is going to increase vegetation. And I think you're saying in the book here that you've seen that. There's a greening of the Earth when you look at it globally. You can see it even from satellite pictures, apparently. So what is the perceived danger of CO2? Is it mainly then that the greenhouse effect is going to warm up our planet to some degree that it's actually going to be hard to function? Again, we're hearing dire predictions of everything from drought to floods to fires, more natural disasters, all these kinds of things here. The sea level rising, glaciers melting, species, disappearing, that sort of thing. Right? That's basically the concern.
Oh, yeah. Man, how many hours do we have?
Yeah, we've
I
got.
could dispute, we can use science, facts, and data to dispute all of that. And I do that in my book. And
Mhm.
it's the lies that your viewers are being told are many and
Okay.
easily debunked. But unfortunately, your viewers don't get a chance to hear the facts because people like me and my colleagues at the CO2 Coalition need to be silenced because we can't speak out because we provide a rational, fact-based narrative that disputes what they're trying to say.
That's
And
always been a concern for me. Why do people get nervous when intelligent questions are asked? That isn't the scientific community supposed to do that? We're
they
supposed to
are.
challenge one another. That's why we're peer reviewing one another's studies and so forth.
Well,
But
here,
in this particular topic, it seems that if you ask the questions, then you're canceled. You're not included in the club anymore. A very interesting quote. I think I saw it actually in your book. It says, "Genius abhors consensus because when consensus is reached, thinking stops." That's Albert Einstein, by the way. The flunky from grade two.
well, I
Yeah.
think you're looking at I have a section on I think I call it notable quotables on
Mm-hmm.
consensus. My favorite was the esteemed Dr. Richard Feynman, physicist, Nobel laureate. And he said, "Now think about this. I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned."
Oh, that's
Think
good.
about that. I'd
That's
rather have
good.
questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And that's what we have today in the climate debate. We had it in COVID. We had the
Yeah.
same thing in COVID,
Yeah.
and it's in spades when it comes to climate change. If you thought people were being silenced in COVID, man, look at the climate scientists, Nobel laureates, physicists that are being silenced in the climate change debate,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to silence us. If they don't, it's game over for the climate crisis crowd because once people, I show people the facts and their eyes get wide and they say things like, "Well, why are they not telling us that? Why are they lying to us?"
Mm-hmm.
And they clearly are. I don't know which one to hit first. I'll tell you what, let's talk about sea level rise.
Sure.
I'll blow it out of the water.
Pun
And,
intended.
oh, good point. I didn't even think about that. Good. So we're told of all these islands around the world that will be underwater in the next several decades. According to the UN, the most at-risk island are the Maldives in the Indian
Yeah.
Ocean. They're only the highest points, I believe, is 14 feet above sea level. And so they're going to be underwater, they say, in a few decades. Okay, 15,000 years ago, the Maldives were also just above sea level. In the last 15,000 years, sea level has risen 400 feet. Why, you might ask, are those islands not under 400 feet of water?
That's a great
Good,
question.
good question, Paul. I knew you were going to ask that. And so the answer is a geologic process known as accretion. And this process allows the islands to grow along with sea level rise. And the corals, these are mostly coral atolls and coral ringed islands, the corals grow very quickly. They can keep up with just about any amount of sea level rise. Uh, but how do you get the islands that are up higher than sea level? And these corals are degraded by storms. One of the biggest things are parrotfish that actually eat the corals, and then it goes in one end and out the other. In fact, 80% of the gravels and sands along a lot of these islands are parrotfish poop, basically. It's forgive me, but that's what it is. And
Wow.
and during storms, they're washed up onto the shore face.
Hmm.
Winds distribute it. Critters move things around. It's a slow process, but geology is a slow process. And so what we need to do is, and so what they're telling you at today's rate of sea level, which is 7 inches per century, by 2050, we'll have 2 inches of sea level rise. So what they're telling you is the last 400 feet of sea level rise didn't put them underwater, but that next 2 inches, look out, they're going to be underwater. It's
People don't hear these these scientific
it's
arguments, and they
it's all
need to.
factual.
You
It's
know,
factual.
yeah, don't confuse me with the facts, you know. Oh, man. If you're just tuning in, I want to encourage you to check out this book. Again, convenientwarming.com is where you can find it. And the book is called A Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. And also you can check out co2coalition.org. You know, maybe I should, you mentioned the coral reefs and so forth. Just before the show, you were telling me about a new kids book that you're coming out with here. Chloe the Clownfish, I believe. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah,
I think
Chloe.
that's a great idea to actually educate our young people because they're kind of, I think, being fed some
Kind of.
misinformation, if you will, here in our current education system, without considering the other side here. And where can people find that? Is it out already or?
It's you can get this particular book you can buy on Amazon.
Okay.
This is the sixth book that we've published. It's the first in what we're calling the Sleep Well series, and so it's Chloe the Clownfish Sleeps Well. And Chloe had gone to school, and Professor Moray Yale was a guest lecturer at her school, and he told her that her home and her family were in great danger because of man-made global warming, and she couldn't sleep at night.
Hmm.
And we use the story then to tell the truth about the Great Barrier Reef and corals around the world to find out that not only is the Great Barrier Reef in really good shape, I work with Dr. Peter Ridd, by the way, who collaborated with me to get the science right. But we saw the greatest coral growth from the surveys in 2024 since they began these surveys of coral growth on the Great Barrier Reef, and it's in great health. We also find that corals like warmer and hotter water. And we're being told the corals in the Great Barrier Reef are being stressed and bleached and killed because of global warming. The facts are the corals at the north end of the Great Barrier Reef, mind you, this is in the southern hemisphere. That way, it's warmer to the north. Grow a lot faster than the ones to the south where it's cold. And the greatest coral abundance is just north in what's called the Coral Triangle of New Guinea, Indonesia, and so forth. And it's much, much, much warmer there, and the corals just love it.
Okay.
And
Now,
so we're using this our members came to me and said we're very concerned that our children are being indoctrinated
yeah,
into the
yeah.
climate culture. They're being taught groupthink and consensus science instead of the scientific method and critical thinking skills.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to be able to think through these things, not just accept, not taught, what to think. We need to be taught how to think.
So
Uh,
let me
yeah.
give we have a specific website for our education. It's
Okay.
co2learningcenter.com, co2learningcenter.com. We have free lesson plans that can be downloaded,
Wow.
PDFs. We give away our books on the website. It's probably easiest to get it on Amazon. but go to co2learningcenter.com. This is our mission. We're not trying to make money. We're trying to
Yeah.
provide information.
Well, I appreciate that. Can you briefly talk about a new study, and I believe this is done by one of your colleagues here, that shows CO2, as I understand it, has almost reached like a saturation point. So, we can put as much CO2 into the air as we want, and basically the overall global temperature is only going to rise a slight bit more because it's just, I don't know how to explain it better than that, but
Well,
how does that work?
Well, it's the warming effect of, remember, we already said that CO2 is greenhouse gas and has a
Yeah.
warming effect. But that warming effect is logarithmic. In other words, it declines. Each additional molecule has less of a warming effect than earlier molecules. So
Okay.
I like to use, let's say you put a coat of paint on your front window, a coat of white paint.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to block out maybe half of the light coming through.
Mm-hmm.
And so you put the next coat of paint on, and that blocks out another 25%. And then the third coat of paint might knock out another 10%, and so on and so on and so on. Each coat of paint that you put on is blocking more light, but less of with each coat. And with CO2 saturation of the wavelengths that excite these,
Mm-hmm.
it's becoming saturated. So it's additional CO2 has less and less warming effect.
Right. So in other words, there's really nothing to lose sleep over, as you pointed out with Chloe the clownfish here.
Exactly.
And again, I know there's viewers probably, making fun of you and me right now, but these are things that we actually have to, walk through step by step. Take a look at the facts, measure it. What are we observing? I mean, climate models are one thing, and from what I've seen, they're pretty inaccurate. Let's stick to the actual measurements that we can get empirical evidence from, and use that. And take a look. What again? Are the Maldives Islands simply disappearing? No, they're not. Even though the sea level is rising slightly. So yeah, I mean, we've got to take a look at this. I mean,
Well,
I
you
guess
mentioned
go ahead.
One of the things you mentioned was wildfires
Right.
increasing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're not. They're not. The Canadian Fire Service. Take a look at the Canadian Fire Service, what they have to say and their data. They're declining, and their
Yeah.
Forest Service. I quote in my first book. They Flannery et al. Paper pointed to increasing carbon dioxide and rising temperatures to actually be the cause of the decline, and that's because CO2 is a strong drought resistant for plants, and it keeps more soil moisture. There's a lot that goes into it,
Right.
but they point to that. And we see the Copernicus satellite went up about 15, 20 years ago, and we were finally able to measure global area burned, and that's definitely in decline. And we see that in the United States, we're seeing that the number and area burned is 20% of what it was 80 and 90 years ago. And so
Yeah.
we can knock that one down. We can talk about extinctions are not increasing at all. They actually have been in significant decline since the early 1900s. Declining extinctions, yes, and that's very well documented. But that's just another
Yeah, it's
thing that
another
you're.
tool in that tool bag of fear. Again, I remember, the polar bears are disappearing. We'd have big, billboards and
No, they're
signs. And
not.
reality is, you look at the stats, and Canadian polar bears, they're actually increasing, not decreasing. So, yeah, facts matter. I mean, let me ask you this, I guess. Why is there so often so many, again, disagreements between credible, scientists like yourself, and then so many of the consensus scientists? I mean, they're real scientists. They work at real universities, and there's this clash. So what is it all about? Have that many people simply, they've been drinking the Kool-Aid, or is there a
Well,
money path to be followed? I know there's
we
some beliefs that this is more about wealth redistribution sort of thing.
there's as to the scientists, turns out it takes a very brave scientist to buck the trend, to buck the
Right.
consensus. And if you do buck the consensus, you're going to lose your funding. And
Okay.
if you're lucky, you may just lose your funding and keep your job. But in many cases, we've seen. In fact, Dr. Peter Ridd that I collaborated with, he got with this Chloe book on. He was fired from James Cook University for telling the truth about the Great Barrier Reef. They fired him, and he won a big settlement a few years ago because for unfair. He got fired for telling the truth, and it turns out there aren't very many brave scientists. And I have one that I hired, Dr. Byron Sepoyan's a science and research associate for working for me at the CO2 Coalition. He called me up. This is 2 years ago. He called me up. He says, "Greg, I want to come work for the CO2 Coalition." And he worked in carbon capture. He wrote papers, spoke at conferences until he got our paper that was published by Dr. Happer and Lenson. It was called Confronting Net Zero with Science. And he read that and opened his eyes and caused him to look. And finally he called me. He says, "Greg, I really want to come work for you. I quit my job." Because he was an honest scientist. And he couldn't continue telling things that weren't true. I guess he was kind of like he was working for the Emperor Palpatine. He wanted to come work for Luke Skywalker. So I said, I got to hire this. I got to hire this guy.
Well, you know what? Again, these are not again flunkies. These are some top-notch scientists we're talking about. They know their stuff. They're highly, highly qualified. So why are they going against the current narrative? Well, facts. They matter. Gregory Wrightstone, our guest. I want to put a plug in for your book here as well, convenientwarming.com. This is important stuff. Thanks for watching, everybody. WizeUp.ca.